It's been almost 3 weeks since the 2026 Six Invitational in Paris wrapped up, and let me tell you, it will go down in Siege folklore as one of the most impossible to predict. Shit, even the grand final threw in a twist that no one saw coming. And in the end, we had the first team to do the double since Penta G2 back in 2018 and 2019. But before we get to the World Champions, we have 19 other teams to talk about first. Some performances were good, others were great, some that were just downright terrible. Also, I apologize in advance for what I'm about to say about some of these teams, because I'm going to be rather scathing about it. So operators, join me as we review the 2026 Six Invitational. Starting with the teams that got eliminated in groups. And as I said 12 months ago, if you're an APAC fan, brace yourself, because this is going to hurt. Kind of. We kick off with Group A's elimination of FearX. Yet again, we have a team that has as much experience and potential as FearX, only to be sent home first for the umpteenth time. I am getting sick of this. You can forgive them for losing to Weibo. They were stupidly good throughout the group stage. Heretic surprised a lot of teams at this SI, so you can give FearX a pass here. But then to lose to NIP, a team that is a shell of their former selves, and leave yourselves vulnerable on the final day of groups, I think that is unforgivable. And do you know what really pisses me off? FearX actually got within 2 rounds of staying alive at SI. The equation against M80 was simple. Beat them without dropping a map, and you stay alive. And when they took the first map of Clubhouse, convincingly I might add, we actually had hope that the South Koreans could pull off the impossible. And they had series point going into the final round of Consulate, only to let M80 break their backs and their hearts in overtime. They were so close, and they let it slip. They would actually go on to win this series 2-1, but it wasn't enough. And do you want to know something really scary? According to Siege GG, Woogieman had the best personal rating of a 1.2 and the best cost at 74%. And he was among the first to be eliminated. That is what I'm really upset about. They can beat the best, but they don't show it consistently enough. And now they've released their coach Dark and every player but Woogieman. Please do something about this, FearX. APAC North deserves far better than this. Technically, the first team to be eliminated from the Six Invitational, Elevate's fate was sealed on day 3 when they lost to Furia and Wildcard won their first map against the Falcons. But we could already tell they were done after they lost to Asia rivals Daystar 2-0 on day 1. And it wasn't even close. The only real highlight was pushing Team Falcons to overtime on Border in map 1 of their series. But that was the only map where they looked remotely competent on. And Falcons will lose to Wildcard 7-0 the very next day on that same map. So take that with a pinch of salt. The worst part in all this is the experience and skill these guys have. And they gave us a performance like this. 4 out of those 5 players were in the bottom 10 throughout the entire tournament. The only person who escaped that was Resets. Most of us, myself included admittedly, expected this result from Daystar, not Elevate. And we already have confirmation that on Twitter that this augurs going back to the drawing board for 2026. What this roster looks like going forward, no one knows, but it has to be better than this. Black Dragons was the team eliminated from Group C, which was kind of expected given who else was in that group. But holy fuck did they make it interesting. Taking a map off their former Brazilian compatriots in D+, was an unexpected twist in day 1. Hell, they pushed to overtime on map 3 and nearly beat the APAC squad. Losing to FaZe Clan the very next day was not at all that surprising, but then they went on to beat G2 in day 4 of groups. 2-0, I will add. I was just as shocked as everyone else was when I found out. Black Dragons were on the verge of eliminating G2 from the Six Invitational in the group stage. They had the capability to do the funniest thing possible. If only they beat Shopify Rebellion in their final day of groups. Nevertheless, despite that impressive win over G2, BD were way out of their depth. And on the subject of out of depth, the final team sent home from groups in Paris. Man, I really don't want to talk about this, but I know I have to. It's fair to say that Enterprise had one of the worst performances at the Six Invitational in history, with no map or series wins throughout the entire group stage. But it's also fair to say that we had put a lot of expectation on a roster that is still fairly new to international tournaments. especially so given that 4 out of those 5 were playing at SI for the first time. I think the reason that a lot of us were disappointed with Enterprise's brief SI stint is the fact that they were on the same trajectory as Team Bliss back in 2023, and it never materialized for EP. To their credit, they didn't play atrociously. In fact, Bappin got an ace against W7M, and they were mathematically in the hunt to escape groups thanks to OXG not winning a series, until their match on the final day of groups. So there was potential. The key word there being was, because shortly after the group stage ended, Fisher Guy announced his retirement from competitive play, as well as relays and player being dropped from the team, and Goran is no longer the coach of Enterprise. So what EP is going to look like going into 2026 remains unknown for now, but it does still remain an enticing project for OCE fans. Oh wow, the copium's strong today. Moving on to the first round of the lower bracket, we had some expected eliminations at this stage, as well as one of the favorites to win SI 2026. Who put this in the script? Oh, right. They did. But we have to begin with Daystar, the team that came up through the APO Last Chance qualifiers and were expected to drown in Group B. Yet despite all odds, they made it into the playoffs and were fairly competitive in a couple of games as well. They actually set themselves up for success with an upset win over fellow Asia squad Elevate on day 1 of groups, beating them 2-0 in a dominant fashion. But while Daystar were able to take a map off of Furia on day 3, they were not able to win another match in groups. But that one win over Elevate was enough for them to make it into the lower bracket in Phase 2. And it was here that they would meet their end at the hands of APAC North's import roster D+02. But they did keep it competitive for some of their games, including their match against Furia. For a roster with 3 SI rookies, Daystar performed commendably, and they should be proud of themselves for the year they've had and their results at SI. The same applies for Team Heretics, the group that came in through the EML Last Chance qualifiers as Project Zero. Lumped into Group A with M80, NIP, and Weibo, many people thought they would have had a rough SI, especially since most of their roster had never been in an SI before, like with Enterprise and Daystar. But, to everyone's surprise, they more than held their own, with wins over against the aforementioned NIP and FearX, and even taking maps of both M80 and Weibo. Their win record actually tied them with M80 on points, only losing out to the NA squad on round count. But that also meant they would start in the upper bracket, which is pretty good for a Tier 2 roster that had to run the LCQ gauntlet. However, this is where the collective inexperience at the Six Invitational would be brought to the forefront, with back-to-back losses against both Furia and Oxygen Esports respectively. Nevertheless, they should be proud of themselves for being able to compete against some of the best teams in the world, and they should take that momentum into the Challenger Series this month. Ninjas in Pajamas were also eliminated here, and if I'm being honest, I should count their lucky stars FearX couldn't close out their match against M80 in 2 maps. Otherwise, they would have been the ones eliminated in groups, and not the South Koreans. Despite some matches where they're able to take maps, they could only muster the one series win against FearX. But thanks to that aforementioned M80 match, NIP would just scrape into the playoff bracket by the skin of their balls. And I do mean just, because the end of the group stage tied with FearX on points, and only just being able to survive thanks to a slightly better round count. There were 3 rounds in it. 3. That's how close they got. And the playoffs were not much better, as they would lose their only match 2-1 against Shopify Rebellion. I can't help but wonder if NIP were also out of their league like Black Dragons was, as one player went positive in the stats for NIP, and that was Pino. Just. Or perhaps it might be because Group A was cursed, because M80 were eliminated here. Yup, the Munich Major Champions were eliminated in the first round of the playoffs after finishing 2nd in their group. Now, that in itself is not bad. You still start in the upper bracket for the playoffs, and you get to pick your opponent in the first round of the bracket. The problem for M80 is the fact that they only won 2 of their matches, and none of them were clean 2-0 victories. As mentioned earlier, they actually tied on points with Team Heretics because of this. But the real red flag was their 1-2 loss to FearX, the team eliminated on the final day of groups. On paper, it should have been a relatively straightforward match for the North Americans, but M80 let FearX get within 2 rounds of beating them 2-0, and saving themselves from elimination. Now, you could make the argument that because there was not as much on the line compared to FearX, M80 didn't take the match as seriously as they should have. But that's not really an excuse for their performance. When the playoffs rolled around, they got matched up against SSG in the first round of the upper bracket, which apparently M80 didn't even want. And that was evident when the astronauts went to school on the Munich Major Champs 2-0, sending them down to the lower bracket to face Fabian's old squad in G2. And by the time they had their final timeout on Fortress, you could tell they were done. Not even Fabian was saying words of wisdom that could pull them back from this. And ultimately, they fell to the EU squad 2-0, ending M80's SI campaign on a whimper. The thing is, though, none of their players had bad performances throughout. Lackluster by their standards, yes, but not what I would consider bad. In fact, Gunnar was tied for first in KD at a +20 and had an overall Siege GG rating of a 1.1. What is even more surprising is that half the roster made it all the way to 4th place in Boston as part of Unwanted, as well as an SI winning coach in Fabian. So the potential was there. And to rub salt in the wounds, Kino recently announced that his contract with M80 did not get renewed for the new season, much to Fabian's annoyance as he wanted to keep the team together after Paris. So 2026 is going to be an interesting season for M80. Watch this space here. 9th through 12th is where we start losing some real heavy hitters in Paris. 2 NA squads bit the dust here. Our remaining APAC teams got cut in half, and the second EU team got eliminated at this point. The other imposter roster from Brazil got eliminated here. But unlike Elevate, who bombed out when they're expected to make a deep run, D+ kept their enthusiasm tempered and were rewarded in the process. In the lead up to the event, Falls had a brief interview with Siege GG and said that even though they were Brazilian players, he and the rest of D+ truly believed that they were an APAC squad, which is a good mentality to have. Elevate, and they got off to a respectable start in groups with wins over Black Dragons and Shopify Rebellion, the latter of which D+ would beat 2-0. However, reality decided to rear its ugly head and hand D+ 2 straight losses to close out their group stage. Their win-loss record in groups was enough for them to start in the upper bracket of the playoffs, where they got matched up against Fluxo W7M. And although map 1 went all the way in round 15, the South Korean org still ended up being sent down to the lower bracket 2-0. From here, they would have faced what I would call the APAC gauntlet. Back-to-back matches against fellow APL squads. First up was Daystar in the first round of the lower bracket, where D+ would dispatch them in a close 2-0. But the second half of the gauntlet is where they would fall, as Weibo 2-0'd them in the second round of the lower bracket. All in all, D+'s performances were pretty respectable for a newly built roster coming into an unfamiliar region, beating Shopify Rebellion in groups, as well as taking a map off of FaZe Clan and nearly doing the same to Fluxo W7M in the upper bracket. Obviously not the result they were looking for, but certainly something to build off going into the new season. OXG was the first NA squad eliminated here, and like with NIP in Group A, they waited until the final match in Group D to confirm their playoff results. Fun fact, they were, once again, the team that qualified through the LCQs to make it through the furthest during the Six Invitational. Last year, they made the top 8 and fell to the NAL brethren in Unwanted. This year, they didn't make it as far, only reaching the top 12. Getting lumped in with Group D was Secret, Fluxo W7M, and Space Station. Oxygen were always going to be in for a rough time, and that was shown in their results during the group stage, losing 2-0 to both Secret and SSG, which included a 7-0 loss to the boys in green, and a 2-1 loss to Fluxo. Their only saving grace came at the expense of Oceanic Squad Enterprise, who they beat 2-0 in a surprisingly close affair. That solitary win was enough for Oxygen to make it into the playoffs. However, they would have to start in the lower bracket. Part of me wonders if Group D was a real group of death. The only win in playoffs was against EML LCQ squad Team Heretics, though it was far closer than I think OXG would have liked. 2-0 with both maps hitting all 12 rounds in regulation. But when they faced off Fluxo W7M in the very next match, they could not keep pace with the Brazilians. Yes, OXG were able to take a map off of Fluxo, but it was the only map that was close. The other two were 7-2 and 7-3. The thing that struck me as concerning is that no one on OXG, according to Siege GG, went above a 1.0 rating. In fact, they didn't even hit that mark. Not one player on OXG went positive on stats across the board, except for Grixer, who was a +2 on entry kills, and Forrest had 14 plants to his name. Ultimately, it was kind of a disappointing campaign for Oxygen when you compare it to their run in Boston, especially considering the firepower at their fingertips. Grixer and Forrest are both experienced runners at the pointy end of the Six Invitational, and the rest of the team, with the exception of Adam, had multiple SI appearances to their name. So to not even make it as far as they did last time with arguably better players, something clearly isn't clicking into place, and the higher-ups seem to agree, as Yaga got benched, and Grixer and Forrest both got dropped within the last couple of weeks, before everyone else was released from their contracts a week after the fact. I have concerns. On the subject of disappointing campaigns, Shopify Rebellion was the second NA team to be eliminated from SI at this stage. And to be perfectly frank, they were not far from missing out on playoffs altogether. Being put in Group C alongside FaZe Clan and G2, Rebellion were always going to be in for a bit of a tough time during groups. Even with the odds stacked against them, they actually got a dream start when they got an upset win over G2 on day one, beating the EU squad 2-0 after both maps went to overtime. Things were looking good for the North Americans. So imagine everyone's surprise when they were at risk of elimination at the end of day 4, after losing to both D+, and FaZe. Day 5 was going to be the real test for Shopify Rebellion, as they were at risk of being sent home early. All they had to do was beat Black Dragons, who had gotten a taste of blood the previous day after they also beat G2. Thankfully, Rebellion did what they needed to do. That second place allowed them to pick their opponents in the first round of the upper bracket, but for some reason, they chose Team Falcons. At first glance, this seemed like a risky pick for Rebellion, but the deeper you dig, the more the choice made sense. Even more so when you consider they were trying to avoid SSG like the plague. And you want to know something? The gamble almost worked, with Map 3 needing all 15 rounds to decide a winner. However, it was the Falcons who took that pivotal final round, sending Rebellion down to the lower bracket. Surviving a brief scare at the hands of NIP, Rebellion found themselves facing Space Station Gaming, the team they were trying to avoid in the upper bracket. And despite, once again, Map 3 going to overtime, Rebellion could not clutch it out when it mattered and found themselves with their tickets home booked. Right now, I just can't figure Rebellion out. Domestically, they are stupidly consistent and always find themselves at the pointy end of the NAL. But throughout all of 2025, whenever they fly out to another country, they fail to deliver on that promise during the regular season. And moreover, no one in Rebellion had a bad tournament. Surf and Ambi were tied at a 1.09, Rexon was a 1.02 and just barely stayed positive. Spoit just being in the negatives is a bit of a worrying sign, but I don't think there's any real cause for concern just yet. Canadian being the worst player on Rebellion, although not by much, is kind of par for the course when you take into account his IGL style and what he brings to the table beyond just raw stats as one of the last mastermind IGLs in the game. There's not a bad performance across the board, but no one that stood out consistently enough for the team in Paris. Let's hope they get themselves sorted out for 2026, though the rumors I'm hearing about the roster doesn't bode well at all. As for G2, well, their time in Paris could be best summed up in one clip.
How well they've worked together as a team. You know, the quiet performance of Surf finds himself.
You are joking,
that's not ideal. You know, and then you've got G2, you know, nading themselves.
Okay.
Some serious drywall.
It's a minor step back. A minor step back. You can't be serious.
Don't hate on me. I just need an excuse to hear Dez lose his mind one more time at G2's expense. But that clip is sort of emblematic of what's going on with G2 right now. No one seems to know what's happening. Their group stage was nothing short of a disaster, with only 2 wins to their name against D+, and a dead rubber for FaZe Clan in day 5. They were on the verge of a group stage elimination after losing to Black Dragons on day 4. Yeah, you heard right. They lost 2-0 to Black Dragons. Both maps going to overtime. Despite some absolute magic from Stolpen that earned him MVP honors on day 5, it was not enough for G2 to escape the lower bracket. I will say this about their group stage. Had they been able to clutch out at least once against either Rebellion or Black Dragons, then G2 would have actually overtaken D+ in the standings and started the playoffs in the upper bracket. But that's the cost of not locking in when it counts. The only real bright spot, if you will, is they were the team to eliminate M80 from SI in a clean 2-0 victory. Though given how the North Americans were playing throughout all of SI, that's not really saying much. Their final map win was against Team Secret in the very next match. But the EML rivals would put G2's run to bed in a dominant reverse sweep. How was it that G2 had much more promise this time out compared to Boston, yet somehow have a worse group stage performance in Paris and end up with the exact same result as SI25? This team is a paradox that is thoroughly doing my head in. Great in small bursts, but rubbish when it counts. And I think the only reason why G2 did as well as they did is because of stomping and his insane mechanical skill. I will go so far as to say that the kid is wasted on G2 right now. No one is stepping up consistently to help him. I feel so bad for his spine right now because he is carrying that team. He was the highest rated player on G2 with a 1.1 rating, the only player with a KD in double digits, and the next best isn't even close, and the most 1BX clutches to his name. Just. Doki and Laura had okay tournaments. Blaz was only just in the negatives, but was saved by the amount of plants to his name, and Alamau, I don't even know. I think I said this last year, but G2 really needs a circuit breaker to get themselves back into consistent form both domestically and internationally. But dropping Blaz is not it. They need a drastic shift in the offseason if they want to make it back to the top of the mountain. And the final teams to be eliminated before the main stage were the last remaining hope for APAC and one of the remaining 2 North American squads. But not the one you might be thinking of. We start this section with Weibo Gaming, the lone shiny star in Group A and the best APL squad of the 2025 season. So close to making it to the main stage, but fell short at the last hurdle, much like Team Bliss back in 2024. Being put in the same group as Munich Major Champions M80, many people, myself included, had pegged them as starting playoffs in the upper bracket, maybe even given their choice of opponents in the first round. But no one in their right mind had these guys claiming the first seed out of their group. The first APAC team to do so since Damwon Kia Gaming did it back in 2022. And the cherry on top? They were undefeated, only dropping a map each against M80 and Team Heretics. Weibo would even 7-0 Fear-X during that match. That was how dominant they were during groups. The playoffs was a different matter. Despite the morning off thanks to their round 1 bye, Weibo would have a challenge ahead of them if they wanted to topple Furia to book their place on the main stage. However, the former world champions were way too good for Weibo, even though the Asian super team did make it close. Sent down to the lower bracket, Weibo would overcome Import Roster D+ in a comfortable fashion to get a second attempt to make the main stage. Unfortunately, they were unable to overcome Team Secret in a close 2-0 loss, letting their last chance at a main stage berth slip right through their fingers. Take nothing away from Weibo missing out on the main stage. They still have had the most consistent roster the APL has seen in a few years, and a far better result than last year's efforts as Team Joel. No one on Weibo went below a 0.9 rating. Reeves was back at his fragging best with Hoven and Turd backing him up fantastically. RP and Speakeasy were both able to do what they do best, and to remain as competitive as they did during their playoff losses. If that's not a call for the rest of the circuit to take these guys seriously, then I don't know what is. The same can't be said for Space Station, however. Or, more accurately, the roster formerly known as Space Station. I'll explain in a sec. Coming into SI, SSG had a huge question mark over them about their performance outside the Americas. Getting grouped in each major set within Europe does not bode well when SI26 was set in Paris. Thankfully for SSG fans, they didn't disappoint initially. The NA squad started group strong with a comfortable 2-0 win over Enterprise, and would surprise Team Secret with a win on Fortress, the first time it was played in a professional tournament since its reintroduction into the map pool, but could not close it out over the EU roster as they would complete the reverse sweep and lose 2-1. And even with a confidence-boosting win over fellow North Americans Oxygen, they would once again stumble after winning the first map, this time against Fluxo W7M. Their position in the upper bracket was confirmed on day 4 after their win against OXG, but their loss to the Brazilians meant they had no choice in their opponents in the upper bracket as a result of them finishing 3rd in the standings. But the funny thing is, no one really wanted to play SSG. Apparently, Shopify Rebellion was actively trying to avoid them when they were sorting out the bracket for playoffs. The team that ended up matching against them was M80, and SSG took full advantage of that, steamrolling the Munich Major Champs 2-0. In spite of that win, they themselves would suffer the same fate at the hands of Wildcard, even with map 2 of Bank going to overtime. Their first match in the lower bracket was against the team that was trying to avoid them, Rebellion. Now fighting for their tournament lives, the NA versus NA brawl goes all the way to overtime on map 3, where SSG claimed the map in series in overtime. However, a rematch against Fluxo W7M does not fall their way, and they get sent home just shy of the top 6, despite some clutch moments late in Clubhouse. So the question is, did Space Station buck their overseas trend? Yes but also no. They didn't get themselves sent home in groups this time out, which is the main thing. But if you look at the teams they beat over the course of their SI campaign, you'll notice a disturbing trend. They were all NA squads, bar one. OXG, M80, and Rebellion were all comfortable opponents for SSG, so they knew what to expect from them. Even Wildcard, who they lost to in the upper bracket. The other thing of note is that with the exception of that Wildcard loss, the North Americans were able to take a map off of their opponents and force a tiebreaker map. However, the fact that we're not able to clutch out that third map 3 times out of 4 kind of speaks to their mental fortitude, even with the team culture they had built over the last few years. I say had because within the last fortnight, Oxygen released the entire roster and support staff. Nuking your roster like that despite solid results, that's cause for concern. NA is going to become a bloodbath during the offseason. And now for our top 6. The 6 teams that had survived the second phase and competed on the main stage in front of a roaring French audience. And while one team sent home at this point was on the rise, it's curtains for the other one. And we need to start with Wildcard, the sole North America team to make the main stage, and perhaps the biggest feel-good story to come out of North America. For the longest time, this org has struggled to make themselves relevant within the North America League, always near the bottom of the leaderboard for the last 2 years. But now, they can consider themselves among the best in the world. In Group B, when they face off against heavyweights Falcons and Furia, Wildcard not only matched them, but also beat them, both in dominations and in close fought maps. In fact, they would actually top their group after going undefeated throughout the entire group stage, which is insane when you think about it. And what's even crazier is they only needed one more win to confirm their main stage berth. One series away from the best result this Organ team can even dream of. And they got it at the hands of SSG. This fledgling roster was going to play in front of a roaring crowd, especially since Baby Shark would be playing in front of his family as a young French rookie. But before we get there, there was one matter to attend to. Would they reach the upper bracket final? Base Clan ahead of them, it seemed like a tall order. Sadly, it was one task too great, as FaZe Clan would dispatch them and send Wildcard down to the lower bracket. The only match Wildcard would play on the main stage, and they would not disappoint, even if they fell 2-0. The boys went down swinging and made it an entertaining watch. This was truly Wildcard's year. Even after a slow start in the NAL, they came roaring back for the second half of the season with a top 4 finish in Munich and now a top 6 in Paris. I am very impressed with this team. Take nothing away from them losing 2 matches straight. They were beaten by the 2 grand finalists, so there's no shame in that one. It's also the first time that most of these guys have ever set foot on a main stage, certainly for Bay, Spiker, and Shark, so I would not be at all surprised that the nerves were starting to get to them. That said, there is going to be a change in the lineup for next year, with Dash returning home to Brazil and a new import coming to take his place. Whether or not this works out remains to be seen, but I am optimistic. Meanwhile, the other team that got sent home at this point, well, this might very well be the last time we see them together. Furia came into this SI as one of the favorites from Brazil. They looked hungry and eager. But like with SSG before, there was a massive question hanging over them. Is this their final tournament as a roster? Inevitably, the worst kept secret throughout all of Paris would be confirmed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Like with Wildcard, Furia would be in Group B. And like with Wildcard, the Brazilians actually got a smoking start by toppling Team Falcons on day 1. In fact, with the exception of their loss against Wildcard, their only real stumble was dropping a map to Daystar on map 4, which cost them an outright second place, instead tying on points with Falcons and only beating them on round count. I wasn't taking much stock in Furia not being at the top of their group because Wildcard was continuing their rise in form and potential for Munich. And the first round of the upper bracket is still a good position to be in, especially with their choice of opponents being Team Heretics. After a quick win over the EU Tier 2 squad and a closer affair with Weber than they were expecting, qualifying for the main stage in the process, Fury would have a rematch against Team Falcons for a spot in the upper bracket final. However, this time it would fall to the predominantly French roster 2-0, sending Furia down to the lower bracket. Their opponents for the lower bracket quarterfinal were favourable, having beaten Fluxo Davis Eminem on a regular basis during the SAL over the last couple of years. Odds were looking good for Furia. But in what ultimately would be their final match together, the match that truly counted, they couldn't get it done over Fluxo, ending their run in the top 6. With the worst kept secret in the paddock now confirmed, as Furia released everyone but Herds, including the coaches, I think this is the best result they could get with hindsight. Second place in their group is still very good when you take wildcard's form into account, and they made it to the main stage through the upper bracket against admittedly easier opponents. What strikes me as interesting is the fact that Herds was the only player from that roster still on Furia. Now, there's all sorts of rumors floating around as to why that is or what the rest of the team is going to do. It is a sad day for Brazil. If wildcard was the feel-good story out of North America, then our 4th place team in Fluxo W7M is it for Brazil. And that's largely down to one man. Newly expecting father Palu. Before we go on, a little bit of context here for those who don't know. The last time that Palu was in Paris was SI 2021. The day before he and the rest of Liquid were set to play in the grand final against NIP, Palu's father passed away. I believe it was due to cancer, if I remember correctly. Even though he had every right to immediately jump on a plane back to his native Brazil, Palu stayed in Paris and played through the grand final with his team supporting him every step of the way. And even though he got MVP honors for the match, and I think also the tournament, Liquid ultimately fell short. Now back in Paris, 5 years later, it was revealed that Palu himself was going to become a father with his longtime partner. He even paid tribute by changing his in-game name to Pilo, which, if you know your Brazilian Portuguese, Pai translates to dad. That is wonderfully awesome. And if you somehow do end up watching this, Palu, congratulations to you and your partner on your upcoming parenthood. Starting the SI run in Group D, Fluxo had a bit of a wobbly first match against OCE Squad Enterprise, but their experience and class won out in a comfortable 2-0. From there, they would lose only to Team Secret on their way to second in the group, with Palu playing out of his mind and snagging 3 MVP honors along the way, 2 of which were in the same series. Picking D Plus as their opponents in the first round of the upper bracket, Fluxo easily did away with them 2-0, despite the first map of Border going all the way to 15 rounds. I guess that's what happens when you send 2 Brazilian squads into a frag-heavy map. But then there were the Giants of FaZe Clan. Fluxo were not so lucky this time, losing 2-1 and getting sent down to the lower bracket. Now playing for their tournament lives, they would get rematched against OXG and SSG in that order. Now, the general wisdom is whenever teams rematch during the same tournament, it's usually the losing team that has the edge. They go back, they review what went wrong, and prepare for it better. Fluxo would defy that logic. Twice. With the exact same scoreline as their group stage wins. Qualifying for the main stage in the process. The dad buff was real for Palu. But now he and Fluxo face down their nemesis, Furia. Ever since 2024, Fluxo has had the wood over Fluxo both domestically and internationally. The Bulls have been able to steal a win or 2, but the majority of the wins went the way of the Panthers. The odds were not in their favor. So imagine Fluxo's joy when they were able to send Furia home on stage after winning the match that mattered most and staying alive in Paris that little bit longer. Fairy tale was slowly coming together for Fluxo. They could almost taste it. Sadly, Team Secret had other ideas for Fluxo's final rematch at SI, going the same way it did during the group stage. You're going to hand it to Fluxo W7M. I don't think anyone was expecting this newly merged organization's debut result to be top 4 of the Six Invitational. A lot of people, including myself, were rooting for Fluxo during that run. And for good reason. Palu was looking for redemption after falling short last time he was in Paris, and him becoming a father for the first time 5 years after he lost his father at the very same event. The narrative writes itself here. And like with Wildcard before, Fluxo would lose their playoff matches to the 2 grand finalists. Twice in the case of Team Secret. I think their win over Furia might be the sweetest of their entire run at SI, especially considering the status of that Furia roster. However, with Volps departing within the last week, things are going to look a little bit different for Fluxo W7M in the new season. Even so, the rest of the SAL should be considering them very seriously. In third place, the hometown heroes and one of the favorites to win SI on home soil. This was the best chance for the dream to come true, and Team Falcons blew it. I had a feeling this would happen, but I didn't want to believe it. I genuinely don't know how they do it anymore. Every time they're on the cusp of greatness, they somehow screw it up. To the Falcons' credit, they did finish the group stage in 3rd, tied with Furia on points, but losing on round count. But there were some alarming performances throughout. Losing 2-1 to Furia on day one, not a big deal. The general rule of thumb is you don't let Brazilian teams play against you on Lair, so a pass is granted there. Beating Daystar 2-0 on day 4 was anticipated. The scoreline for both maps was to be expected. But nearly losing Border to Elevate on day 2 was the first red flag, even though they went on to win the very next map quite dominantly and take the series in the process. But they also lose to Wildcard 7-0 the very next day on the very same map of Border. And this time, the Falcons would lose the series 2-1. You probably can't tell by my expression, but I'm concerned. Starting their playoff run against Shopify Rebellion, the Falcons were very nearly sent down to the lower bracket by the NA squad. But alas, they were able to clutch out in the 15th round of Map 3 and continue the upper bracket run. Following 2 more convincing wins over Team Secret and Furia, the EU Super Team will come up against the brick wall of FaZe Clan, the very team that beat them at last year's SI Grand Final in Boston. After taking each other's map picks, we were salivating at the prospect of a Map 3. The crowd was behind their hometown favorites, willing them to the Grand Final. But, you remember that rule about not taking Brazilian teams to Lair?
On to Shaiko, gets rid of the Grim. 3v2. Falcons still have the extra player, but Handy is just so good. It's going to be down to the 1v1. Brede going for the plant inside of Mask as Vidiking makes his move. The Shamika launcher couldn't end it. It pushes him off, and indeed 7-0.
FaZe Clan decimated Team Falcons. Picked them apart, tore them to pieces. Whatever verbiage you want to use, the net result is the same. Team Falcons were on their way to the lower bracket on the back of a 7-0 map loss. Their second of the tournament, I will remind you. That must have shattered Falcons' confidence going into the lower bracket final against Team Secret. A situation they've never been in. And even though it was close, Team Falcons would still lose the lower bracket final 2-0. Ending their Six Invitational on home soil in third. For all the firepower at this Team Falcons roster's disposal, the intelligence these players have, the mechanical skill, the clutch factor, all of it for nothing. Again, for the last 2 years, they have perpetuated a pattern that has become so ingrained in their DNA that it is almost reliably predictable. Every time this roster has a chance for greatness, they falter at the final hurdle. And it all comes down to one man, Shaiko. And don't take my word for it either. Des actually brought up the following stat on Twitter just after the Falcons were eliminated. And it's this. In the 7 matches where this roster was eliminated from Ubisoft run tournaments since SI 2023, Shaiko only went positive once, at Munich. It has finally gotten to the point where the Falcons management have said enough is enough and put Shaiko on the bench, very possibly putting him in contract jail for at least stage 1 of the EML. But who are they going to get to replace him? Well, whoever they are, I do not envy the position they find themselves in. And please, for the love of Lucifer, make this work. I don't think I can take another year of nearly good enough from this roster. If this somehow fails again, then I think we should seriously consider the possibility of Falcons never winning anything. Our runners-up in Paris might very well have had the best comeback story since SI 2026. Last place to grand finalists in the span of 12 months, this team was so close to capping off the perfect year. But alas, Team Secret couldn't get it over the line. Topping Group D with an undefeated group stage, only dropping maps to SSG and Fluxo, it was one of the more dominant performances during this phase. But Secret actually stumbled relatively early in the playoff bracket, losing the opening match to Team Falcons. However, we've seen lower bracket gauntlet runs happen before. The last 3 world champions did the full lower bracket run on their way to a championship. So it was certainly possible for Secret to still win it from this point. From here, they would eliminate G2 in a reverse sweep and APL's last hope Weibo on their way to the main stage. Wildcard gave them a bit of a scare during their first match on stage. Fluxo fought like hell to keep their fairy tale run alive. Nothing could stop Secret. Not even Team Falcons after their demoralizing loss to FaZe Clan the previous day. So Grand Final day approacheth. The first SI Grand Final for any of them. The crowd was at their back, as Mowgli was the only Frenchman playing. The The first two maps were not great. 7-4 and 7-2 on console and bank, respectively. And going on to map 3, we were staring down the barrel of a 3-0 grand final. But Fortress was an impregnable beast. The newest map in the comp pool, and people were still figuring this map out. It was actually the least played map in the tournament. And FaZe Clan picked it as their map 3. Secret needed a hero if they wanted to save their tournament life and push this to map 4. And they got one in June. Let me tell you, that man is a fucking beast. During overtime, which as a reminder is infinite during the Six Invitational Grand Final, June found himself the last man standing in a 1v3. One of the most impossible positions to win it from here. If he lost, FaZe Clan would win Fortress, the series, and the tournament.
Can't find many, but he finds the first two. Finicking
10 seconds.
To give FaZe everything they've been searching for years. It's June!
And June pulled it off. Twice.
On the exterior breach, it could be an important block, but he swings and misses. KDS takes him down. June once again, last man standing, 1v3. He's been here before.
He's done it once and he can do it again. Step one. Cyber is down. KDS is low HP and he knows exactly where he is.
One more has the case. Has the case, top blue to his right.
The best player of each team go head to head.
Now with a fire in their souls, Secret were on the charge as they began Border. They had the crowd on their side and the momentum. And as is the theme for SI 26, we actually had the first SI Grand Final to have multiple maps go to overtime. But this time, Secret will not pull off the same trick as they fell at the final hurdle. Even if we ignored their performance throughout the year, which by the way has been very bloody good, Secret more than redeemed themselves after last year's horror show. To come so close to winning the org's first ever World Championship is no small task in itself. And June wasn't the only one who shined when needed. New recruits Noah and Mowgli both had moments of brilliance. The former was actually the best rated player on Secret and had the best entry kill stats of all players, along with Gunner from M80. Adrian was the only player to go negative for Secret, but it was only by the smallest of margins. Had this roster stayed together for 2026, then I reckon we could have seen them go to a whole new level. But alas, Adrian has signed on with Wildcard in NA to replace Dash, and June has also departed with no word on where he's headed next. But the rumor mill is alight, so keep an eye on there. Nevertheless, these lads should be incredibly proud of the turnaround they had, and Secret is in a good place for the new season. And now for our world champions. And for all the talk of this SI making history, well,
in Brazil, their hearts were broken. In Boston, they saw redemption. Today, in Paris, one hammer makes a champion, but two hammers makes history.
That was the moment where history was made. FaZe Clan have done something only one other roster has done in the history of competitive Siege. They have won back-to-back Six Invitationals. But they've done way more than that. They have written themselves into the history books in so many ways. And there was a lot, so bear with me here. They're the first team to be in 3 SI Grand Finals in a row, the first Brazilian players to win multiple World Championships, the first 5-stack to win it back-to-back. Shate was with Penta in 2018, Kanto was G2 2019. FaZe itself is the first organization to win it back-to-back. Handy is the first player to win back-to-back tournament MVP honors. I think that's it. I'm bound to have missed something. No, there is something I missed. FaZe Clan are the first team since 2021 to win SI from the upper bracket. They had a near undefeated run throughout the entire tournament. The only match they lost was a group stage match that had no bearing on their standings. First place in Group C, got the upper bracket bye they needed, sent all challengers down to the lower bracket, and held their nerve against a fast approaching Team Secret to win their second SI together. And the amazing thing is, they're still innovating. I think it was the grand final on console, where they were doing a rappel take on console, and they had a ram on board. First, that didn't make any sense, as there was no vertical above them, and it made even less sense when they shredded the default plant spot behind the bookshelf wall. But then it all kicked into place when T'Chaka's Shumika launcher lobbed their Molotovs, and it fell right through the floor. The mollies didn't land, and the fire didn't damage the planter. allowing for a successful plan and hold of that bomb site. I'm not sure what else to add at this point. I've said more than enough. These guys have truly made a dynasty for themselves, remaining unchanged for 3 years, kept plugging away after their failure in 2024, and now they will go down in Siege folklore. Congratulations to your new back-to-back world champions, FaZe Clan. A brief word on the event itself. It was amazing. The theming was on point, the graphics used were gorgeous, the soundtrack was pitch perfect, and the arena. Oh, the arena. It was beautiful. It invoked a similar vibe to Sao Paulo in 2024. And the flowers embedded in the main stage itself, mwah, icing on the cake. Some of the content pieces in between games were really well done. I was a big fan of the coaches roundtable show during the main stage. All in all, this was a huge win for Ubisoft and their SI production team. And with that, we come to the end of my final video for the 2025 season. Let me know in the comments below what your favorite moment from 2025 was. With 2026 already underway with the Challenger Series kicking into full swing this weekend, this season is going to be the most promising in recent history. And also the most hectic. As always, I hope you join me as we navigate the new season. Speaking of the Challenger Series, I apologize for this video taking as long as it did to get out. I've been doing a lot of community casting for the APL Challenger Series, as well as a brief stint over in the EML as an analyst for one of Deanic's community productions. While I thoroughly enjoyed my time behind the proverbial mic, it did put a bit of a time crunch on me getting this video out. Hopefully, if I continue to do more community casting throughout the year, which I am aiming to do, I'm not going to be as affected time-wise, but that is going to be a balancing act I have to work on along the way. But for the final time for the 2025 season, until next time, operators, this is Resident Silverwolf signing off.